Hello there, good afternoon ladies and gentlemen. This is L24 Daily Special Coverage. I'm your host Abdurrahim Kashur, and today's eye will be on Ukraine referendums. The Kremlin installed governments of the four Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine have all declared victories in the so-called annexation referendums. Authorities published claims that an unprecedented majority of residents said yes to join in Russia on Tuesday evening. Moscow could officially claim regions around 50% of Ukraine within days. Russia's parliament has embarked October the 4th to consider annexation. According to Reuters, the polls which Russian President Vladimir Putin announced along with the partial mobilization last Wednesday have been blasted by the West as a sham. In Kherson, the head of the voting committee put yes vote about above 87%. Lugansk authorities said 98.4% of people there had voted to join also Russia, while in Zaporozhye the statistics reached 93.1%. Denis Pushlin, the head of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, said 99.2% of participants in the region had voted to join also Russia. The referendums are over, the results are clear. Welcome home to Russia. Putin allied Dmitry Medvedev, a former president who serves as a deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, wrote on Telegram. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by Mr. Ruslan Bortnik, head of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics from Kiev. And from England, Gunter Wazenbach, Associate Professor in Political Science, University of the West of England. And from India, Niranjan Marjani, a political analyst. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us in this discussion. A short break, and we start our debate. And before we delve into discussion, let me read for you this piece of information. After the apparent victory of yes to the annexation of the four occupied Ukrainian regions, the United Nations and the EU have made it clear that will not recognize the result of the pro-Russian referendums, while the president of Ukraine has called for an isolation of the Kremlin in all international organizations.
Pro-Moscow authorities in occupied Luhansk claim that residents in the region voted to join Russia in referendums the US and Western allies have dismissed as illegitimate. According to Russian-styled election officials, 93% of the ballots cast in the Zaporozhye region supported annexation, as did 87% in Kherson region, 98% in the Luhansk region, and 99% in Donetsk.
The question is, are you in favor of joining Russia as territorial entity of Russian Federation? 1,636,300 participants of the referendum responded yes. 60,555 participants of the referendum responded no. The election has taken place.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky derided Kremlin-run referenda in occupied regions of Ukraine as a farce in his nightly video address on Tuesday.
Ukrainians, I have just taken part in a meeting of the UN Security Council. The crime of aggression against our state, the farce in the occupied territory, which the occupiers called referenda, the preparation of another attempt to annex Ukrainian territory.
The United States in turn said it will be tabling a resolution condemning the referendums being held in eastern Ukraine.
The United States will be tabling a resolution condemning the sham referenda being held in Ukrainian territory. We know the outcomes of these sham referenda were predetermined in Moscow.
The EU, for its part, has denounced the falsified results of the referendums and has considered it yet another violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
There will be consequences for everyone who participates in these illegal, illegitimate referendums. But we do not want to comment on the process of preparing the sanctions list at this time.
The leaders of breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine are on their way to Moscow to formalize their annexation to Russia, following the referendums held in 4 territories controlled by Russian troops, in which most of the voters supported this option.
So, since you are in Ukraine, Mr. Ruslan, I'll be starting with you. The latest rounds of votes in the separatist regions caused more than 90% in general to join Russia. If this really happened to be the case now, how Ukrainian government is going to deal with this referendum votes? The residents over there, they want really to be Russians.
In any case, these so-called referendums are illegal, worthless, and they will not be recognized from the international law and from Ukraine. Ukraine government is not going to stop our counteroffensive on these territories and will continue to elaborate these areas in any case, even with referendums. Of course, there were no any competition in these referendums, and moreover, we even can't confirm the number of people who maybe participated in this referendum. Pro-Ukrainian part of society of these regions hasn't accepted any participation in these referendums, and from our side we see not more than 20% of population participate in this referendum, not even more. So Ukraine will continue our counteroffensive operation. No any legal or law results should be accepted from this so-called referendum, but there will be a political and military impact of these referendums. I'm afraid that Russia will use these so-called referendums to escalate a new stage of war through the mobilization and to start a new wave of nuclear power blackmailing.
Very good indeed. Coming to you, Mr. Gunter. Mr. Gunter, referendums in the Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions reached the end point with a Russian upper hand. In other words, to wins, or rather, a win to Moscow's cause. So, how do you explain this latter? Does Russia have the right to hold this referendum, or this is another violation of international law by Putin, as the US are claiming?
Yes, I would say that it is a clear violation of international law and also of the UN Charter. We had a declaration by the G7 recently, also essentially saying that these referenda are discredited. It is basically the same playbook that Putin used in the case of the annexation of Crimea. So in that respect, it is nothing new, but the expectation that the international community would accept them as legitimate is really ludicrous. So I think it is, among international lawyers, among most of the memberships of the UN recognize that you cannot have a referendum while still military operations are taking place, when people come, in uniforms to the doors of potential voters, reminding them to cast a vote. Things like that are just unacceptable, and for that reason, I think these referenda will not be recognized for sure.
Thank you so much for this explanation. Mr. Marjani, Mrs. Purnima Anand, who worked as an observer from India during this referendum and belongs to the BRICS International Forum, is shown on a TV broadcast saying, in the Western media, they tell us that people are forced at a gunpoint to vote. We are here today and we can see for ourselves that the people, whole families with a smile on their face, are coming to exercise their absolute right to vote for joining Russia. People are happy here and hope shines in their eyes for a peaceful, long-awaited future as part of Russia. So, do you think now, what's your comment on this? And will India recognize this referendum votes?
Well, from what I learned, India has denied sending any observer for this referendum, and also that Indian government has said that there is no such organization under BRICS with the name of BRICS International Forum, and all the organizations that come under BRICS, they are intergovernmental organizations. So as such, India has denied sending any of its observers for this referendum. And for Ms. Purnima Anand's part, she said they have been trying to register with the BRICS. So that is how it stands. India has officially not sent any observer. And with regards to your second question, if India will recognize this referendum, then India's stand has been consistent from the beginning, and that it has not taken any sides. And also that if we remember, during when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, even at that time in United Nations, India had abstained from voting, and same thing has happened during this Russia-Ukraine war as well. India has abstained from voting, and right from the beginning of this war, India has called for dialogue and diplomacy to resolve any issues, and further India has also called for respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all the parties involved. So considering India's stand, and also when Prime Minister Modi met Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the SCO summit in Uzbekistan, he also made it clear that this is not the era of war, and that any issues should be resolved by dialogue and diplomacy.
Very good.
So that has
indeed.
been India's stand, and I think India would not take sides in this referendum as well, and India would continue with its stand.
Very good indeed, and derives from your words saying that peaceful talks may put a solution for this crisis in Ukraine. Mr. Gutna, do you really believe that we still have a chance for a peaceful talk between Ukraine and Russia for a better solution?
Well, at this point, this is very hard to imagine. At the same time, of course, diplomatic channels remain open. And at some point in the distant future, it might well be again possible that both sides enter into forms of negotiation. But at this point in time, obviously diplomacy has failed, and it is an ongoing violent conflict where the end is not clearly on the horizon. At the same time, there has been, for example, quite recently an exchange of prisoners of war that could be seen as at least as a little diplomatic success story. But we are a long way off from peace negotiations with regards to this conflict, because both sides, there's very little point where you would see potential of finding a compromise or a solution. As long as the territorial integrity of Ukraine is challenged, I don't think that the Western community is willing to support major diplomatic efforts. And on the other hand, Russia, of course, seems to be bent on making territorial gains which run against international law, and the West, is not willing to accept that. So we have a kind of a real standoff here, a real conflict. And for that reason, diplomacy at the moment really is in the background. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I wouldn't put a lot of hope into that aspect of international relations at this stage.
Very good indeed. Quite understood. Mr. Ruslan, Ukraine's advances last couple of weeks pose a question for the whole world. Can Kiev actually win? Some analysts now are confirming that it was a strategic withdrawing by the Russians to annex territories without losing more men, but only using this referendum votes. What are you saying about this?
Of course, Ukraine has a good chance to liberate all our territories. Of course, it depends a lot on the level of military and financial support from United States, Great Britain, and another our allies. And talking about the strategical withdrawal, it's very popular in Russian mass media thought, but in any case, Ukrainian troops nowadays are in Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast already. And Ukrainian troops is continue to this counteroffensive near the Krasny Liman, near the Kupiansk. Now our troops in Lugansk Oblast. So I don't think so. I think it was a military loss from the Russian sides. And nowadays, Russia using the mobilization and referendum like two horsemen of changing the political military situation. Russia is trying to switch over this conflict to capture again the political and military initiative which was lost because of Ukrainian counteroffensive last months.
Mm-hmm. Quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. Marjani, as a straight point, do you really think it was really a strategic point of withdrawing the troops, the Russian troops? And now we can see that the Western media was playing a propaganda saying that Russia is losing the war. But at the real moment, at real time, now Russia is kind of making votes of referendum and making it kind of legal for themselves to get control over these regions.
Well, one thing is certain that the war has certainly not gone according to Russia's plan as Russia would have hoped at the beginning. Since Russian military tried to attack Kiev and they were hoping that they would easily win Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, and the war would be over in a few days. But that didn't happen. And also Russia may have taken a strategic decision of withdrawing its troops from Kiev and just focusing on the eastern region. But also the Ukrainian army has shown tactical superiority over Russian army, and also all the help and all the arms and ammunition it has been getting from the Western countries. That has helped the Ukrainian military to prevail over Russia, at least in some parts, and they are able to gain some areas, win some areas back. But Russia does not have any kind of backup, and that's why I believe maybe as pressure tactics, they are using this partial mobilization, nuclear threats, and this referendum. So it's a combination of that. That is not to say that Ukraine cannot increase its attacks and will not try and retake those areas that Russia is currently occupying, or that even Russia would not intensify those attacks. That is very much possible the way the war is going. There seems to be no end, and and nobody is ready to back off. So I think maybe Russia has strategically withdrawn, but even Ukraine has shown tactical superiority in this case, what we have seen from past few days.
Mm-hmm. Quite understood. Now let's tackle another topic in our discussion, which occurred in the Baltic Sea. The European countries on a scramble to investigate unexplained leak into Russian gas pipelines running under the Baltic Sea near Sweden and Denmark. The Kremlin, on the other hand, said that the leaks affected the energy security of the entire continent. Neither pipeline was pumping gas to Europe at the time the leaks were found amid dispute over the war in Ukraine. But the incidents will scupper any remaining expectation that Europe could receive gas via the Nord Stream 1 before winter. Now, Mr. Ruslan, coming to you, some analysts claim that the Russian military mobilization is not made for Ukrainian cause, but rather to strengthen the army presence in the face of the 3,000 Western troops, in other words, NATO troops gathered in Eastern Europe near the Russian border. What are you saying about this before talking about this leak?
We have our special confidential resources from local governments in Russia, and we have a lot of information about that Russia is going to gather much more mobilized person, much more soldiers than it was announced before. As we know from the two local governments from Russian territories, the only two local governments, Stavropol and Crimea, gathered more than 100,000 people. It means that Russia is going to gather maybe a few millions or much more, 1 million person through this mobilization. And of course, it looks like Russia is going to start a new stage of this war and not against only Ukraine. Moreover, there are a lot of information that the Russian troops is going back to Belarus again. To the western borders with Poland, with the Baltic countries. So you should be right. Talking about these leaks, it's very dangerous situation because it means this leaks of Nord Stream 1. It means that we have real war without rules, without any rules, and there is a big danger, so energy dangers for all Europe, and every side should make new catastrophic steps in this war.
Quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. Gunter, how can you explain this gas leak in Stream pipeline? Is it Russian-made as that one of maintenance, or this is a real attack to worsen the situation more?
As far as I know, the authorities from Denmark and Sweden are still investigating, but of course you don't have to be a mastermind that it looks very much as if that has been an act of sabotage and a damage inflicted perhaps by a special Russian operation or something of that nature. It shows that, in a particular critical time, that Russia is able to conduct a kind of hybrid warfare, that it is obviously able to strike targets, and that it also makes very clear to the West that it doesn't seem to have any kind of interest to revive its energy trade with other European nations. And I think it's supposed to send a message in that direction. So I know that several politicians in the West have already stated that it looks very much like a damage inflicted with purpose by Russia, but of course a final confirmation of this is still outstanding. But it would fit a pattern of hybrid warfare that Russia has exercised for quite some time. And it also makes clear to the Western public that, of course, both the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines is considered critical infrastructure on part of the European Union, and that also would be a potential target in case that this conflict continues. So the timing and the geographic area where this occurs, of course, is all very, very suspicious. And
I'm sorry to enter in the middle of your thoughts, but European countries since the beginning of this war have been holding monthly meeting with no vision ahead for a better solution. They were only focused on how to aid Ukraine with weapons, but why they don't want Zelensky to have a peaceful talk to end this crisis? Why they keep escalating the war? Especially in March 2022 this year, there were a close negotiation between Russia and Ukraine, but Germany, UK, as well as USA, they escalated the situation. Yet, for Germany, no available, well-secured alternative for Russian gas, but they are still backing up Ukraine in all means.
Well, I think it is not entirely true that you can blame the Europeans for the escalation of this situation. Of course, the European Union has a process by which they try to formulate their foreign policy and their actions vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia as well. And as part of that process, the member states and their foreign policy makers meet on a regular basis. And by no means, I think, is it true to say that they were only interested in an escalation of the situation. I mean, the EU has introduced numerous measures, say, for example, on the humanitarian side, in order to mitigate the consequences of that conflict. And the message has always been very clear, and I think the Ukrainians made that message also very clear that, Russia can stop this conflict anytime. They just have to leave the territory of Ukraine, and then this thing will come to an end. But the list of measures taken by EU countries in order to mitigate and to deal with the consequences, especially the humanitarian ones, has been very long. It's not just reserved to military aid, but a lot of humanitarian aid. There's been a big fund for the potential rebuilding of Ukraine after this war has ended. And the list is much longer. And as I said earlier, of course, diplomatic channels, specifically via Turkey, are open. Mr. Macron had several attempts to talk to Mr. Putin, for example. So I think, again, it is, it's in the realm of fantasy to argue that the Europeans have an interest in pure escalation of this, quite the contrary.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gunter. Coming to Mr. Marjani, if this war, the so-called special military operation, goes on for longer period than it already has, will this energy crisis that crippled Europe's economy spread to other sectors and other fields, such as health and education? And could the Asian continent economically replace the EU production for the whole world?
It would be too early to say if the Asian continent could replace EU for the whole world, but yes, Asia could certainly play an important role, particularly economies like India, China, Japan. So Asia has a role to play, and maybe this could be an opportunity for the European countries to increase their engagements with the Asian continents and to strengthen their economic cooperation and look for more avenues, because as far as India is concerned, India has always voiced about the energy security and food security, which the crisis that has been the result of this Russia-Ukraine war, and the ways to resolve those issues. And also India has been calling for diversification of supply chains and also like manufacturing facilities. But for that, Asian countries and also India, they would have to provide those facilities, provide a conducive environment for businesses to relocate and to engage more. So I think, yes, Asian continent has a role to play, if not immediately replacing the EU, but at least to diversify their economic engagements.
Quite interesting points you have raised. Now let's tackle the last point in this discussion. The Russian Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev said on his Telegram channel on Tuesday that the NATO alliance will not interfere if Russia uses nuclear weapons in response to Ukrainian aggression. He added that Kiev must realize that to some degree, the message said, let's imagine that Russia is forced to use its most formidable weapons against the Ukrainian regime, which has committed a large-scale act of aggression that is endangering the very existence of our state. I believe that NATO will not directly interfere in the conflict, even in this scenario. Sir Ruslan, what's your word on this threat of a nuclear use?
Of course, it's blackmailing of Ukraine, blackmailing of Western partners of Ukraine, but it's not only blackmailing. And this is a big problem because Russia is ready to use their nuclear weapon against Ukraine, and there is a prominent risk of using of nuclear weapon against of Ukraine. I think, and we should recognize this risk, and we should make a deal with this risk, because we have situation before this war when our government and where some of our partners were not ready to listen the American and Britain partners when they said us about the possible Russian intervention. So it's a great problem. It's the biggest problem, I think, in this war, and we should not only defend our country, but also we should looking for the peaceful communication, political dialogue between the sides. And I have a hope for the role of such countries like United States, China, India, big countries, which should be a good negotiators between the Ukraine and Russia, between the West and Russia, of course.
Quite understood. Mr. Mourjani, briefly speaking, so we can give a couple of minutes between you and Mr. Gutner. Do you really believe that Russia can use its nuclear arsenal in Ukraine, as Medvedev stated? And to some extent, don't you think that the Western allies are pushing Moscow to the limits?
Well, it's difficult to say if Russia would use nuclear weapons, but I believe it shouldn't, because then it would lose its leverage. Because even at the start of this Russia-Ukraine war, I believe that Russia could have just pushed for some diplomatic solution by building pressure instead of actually starting the war. So I do hope it doesn't make the same mistake again, because then it would be because it would stand to lose, and then there would be no end to this war. There would be the impact would not remain limited to Russia and Ukraine, but it would spread to other parts as well. And most importantly, then Russia would not have any deterrent or any leverage if at all it decides to come to the discussion table. That's what I believe.
I've been called to put an end to the discussion because we have reached the limit. So, Mr. Gutner from England, Mr. Mourjani from India, Mr. Rusna from Ukraine, thank you ever so much for taking part with us in this debate. And to this, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you also so much for being with us. Yeah, you can watch again this special coverage on our 24 YouTube channel. And for now, take care and bye-bye.